Okay, I want to briefly overview the key components of sophistry, some of which weren't touched on in the chapter that we read. So I just want to make sure that we get the foundation. So it should be obvious at this point. Yes, these texts were written, but, and we'll see this when we get to the Rhetorica ad Herennium, the foundation of rhetoric was oral, and memory was one of the key components of it. And so rhetoric was assumed to be an oral approach. We spoke it. Rhetoric is spoken in this time period. Again, writing was looked down upon. If you watched the video earlier, Plato hated writing. You're going to see this again. And well, we actually probably won't talk about it because it doesn't come up in the Plato chapter, but Plato hated writing. Plato hated the pencil. The pencil was evil. Because it's all focused on the oral communication, oral discussion, talking back and forth. Education was very specifically oral. That's how everything worked. Then if we break it down further, there were kind of three situations, although this is a question, right? So the way, like the three spaces that rhetorical theory, so we're developing the way of understanding how communication happens in this area, how communication happens in that, and how communication happens in that. So the three areas: judicial rhetoric, which is obviously within the judiciary system; deliberative rhetoric, which happens in the government, so we're coming up with the laws; and then demonstrative rhetoric, which is happening in kind of other public life, but it's really business public life and business public sphere. And so we've got judicial, deliberative, demonstrative. In each of these three areas, for the most part, we're talking, again, rich, white, landowning men. Although we'll see with Plato, and then we saw with the Sophists, Plato has caveats within his theory where people from lower classes can move up if they are better philosophers. One of the biggest critiques against the Sophists is that they were selling they were selling their teaching. And in selling their teaching, one, you had access to better rhetoricians, better sophists if you had more money, and so it was exclusionary. But at the same time, it was incredibly accessible because younger sophists or sophists with less reputation would sell their education on the street corner, meaning everyone had access, including the plebes, right? And that's always the big concern. If we give education to the masses, they might revolt. They might not like the rules that in the judicial they're being accused of not following, or in the deliberative space we are setting against them, or to not benefit them, but to benefit the people making the laws. So yeah, it was one of those. Sophists were bad for two reasons that are literally exact contradictions of each other. Sophists are bad because highest bidder wins. Person with the most money gets access to the best teaching, the best level of education. Sophists are bad because they are bringing education to the masses. This is hotly debated still. Like we're reading the texts that survived. We're reading not even, because for the most part, texts written by the Sophists, or what we can put together as notes maybe of the students of the Sophists, didn't really survive the burning of Alexandria, if they even existed, right? And so this is another space where, super random fun fact, super random fun story. As Alexandria was burning, texts did survive, and they were kept. They were kept by, because like we're talking about Greece heading into what is now Greece, expanding into what we now understand to be Turkey, which would have been the Ottoman Empire. And we have a huge Muslim population because Islam is developing in this whole area, right? And so even though Greek had a different spiritual system than Islam had, there were, because of the trade between the two, and so we're talking like early Spice Road type interchange and exchange across people and across cultures and across groups. We had a lot of Greek texts preserved in or by Islamic people, even though it was a completely different culture. So super random fun fact, the reason that we have a lot of these texts is because they left the Greek area and headed towards, like the Far East regions, and if not even further than the Ottoman Empire extended into those areas and then survived. And so it's whatever we have that survived that we're trying to understand all of this through, right? Okay, so oral, and then you need to know that it is judicial, deliberative, demonstrative. And then just really briefly, the other big thing that is a huge debate between what we'll see as like a belief of the Sophists and then a belief of Plato is the idea of little t truth and big T truth. Like literally capital T and lowercase t is how we usually write it, and we say little t and we say big T. So big T truth is an absolute truth. And there are, according to Plato, absolute truths, philosophy, and what philosophy can uncover. And, we'll see this with Plato on that, this particular concept is not discussed in the chapter because it's not the goal, but Plato's goal was to uncover and to help people uncover big T truths. What are, and again, we're dealing with being, like big B being, or again, jumping ahead a couple hundred years, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We're talking about that version of philosophy. What are the universal truths of humanity, and how do we govern from that as the foundation? Like, that is Plato's big T truth, and that is what he's heading for, and he has an answer. It is philosophy, and philosopher kings are the answer because they are coming from the most true, and that is the only way to be. Like, if we talk, are humans good or are humans evil, the way towards goodness, and this is a debate that happens in a lot of Plato texts, the way towards goodness is philosophy. And so philosophy and what we're unpacking there, and that kind of goodness, that justness, that is all coming from big T truth. In opposition to that, and it's probably the opposite direction, right, where Plato is in opposition to the Sophists believed in little T truths, that there are truths that exist for specific groups that don't exist for other groups. There are ways of being. Okay, so the example I typically use, I was born and raised in Arizona, and then I came here for this job at Millersville, and so regionally, there are very different geographies outside, right? Like, I have a thriving garden I'm pointing to my backyard because I'm at home. I have a thriving backyard, or thriving garden. I've got cucumbers that grow, and tomatoes that grow, and flowers that grow, and I have gorgeous roses. None of that exists in Arizona. When I grew up in Arizona, where fire is very dangerous, very dangerous. Like, I see a fire that's not put out or not attended or not carefully guarded, and I immediately jump to forest fire, like immediately. And so coming here and seeing people with their backyard bonfires, just, I cringe, and I get really, I don't know how to understand it. Like, my little T truth for understanding a backyard fire is forest fire. And I had, a couple decades worth of understanding things that way. And so I don't know how to undo all of that, where people from this region who grow up with a much more moist environment with things that don't catch on fire the way that they do in Arizona has a completely different little T truth. Like, they are literally operating in and navigating the world from a completely different baseline than I do. Completely different. And the Sophists started from that most people in most city-states, now we're really talking Greek expansion here. So we've got a lot of different city-states, a lot of different citizenship, a lot of different citizenry, and a lot of people who are not granted access to citizenship. And so the Sophists are really navigating what is a little T truth, and how do we understand and build persuasion around that for these various instances and for these various truths, because these are ways from which people are operating. Are they that sophisticated with their understanding of thinking? Not quite, but we're getting there. And we really do see this is the major difference between the Sophists and Plato. And this is one of Plato's huge pushes against the Sophists. He doesn't believe that all of these little ideas can be that He doesn't believe they should. Let's put the should in there. Sorry. He does not believe that these little instances should be the way we understand. Those are the things, like if we do the metaphor of the cave, and it comes up in the Plato chapter, those are the things we need to set aside. Those are the things we need to not use to help our understanding, because they are just distractions. They are reflections on the cave wall. They shouldn't be important. We need to get to the real philosophy, the root of our being, and the root of citizenship and citizenry, to move into philosophy. And then those that are super capable go from philosophy to philosopher king. King is kind of problematic, right? Because where does the king fit within a democracy? So this is not a class about that, but there are lots of questions that I have about Plato's theories there, but that's okay. So we really want to understand from the Sophist perspective, like the start of rhetorical theory development. So when we look at the start of rhetorical theory development, it is oral, it is not written, although we use it written. And today, communication still has a whole version of oral rhetorical theory that they look at. We're obviously looking at the written form, but we're starting with oral because paper didn't exist the way that it did, and some texts didn't survive the way that we wanted them to. So oral is the foundation for all of these ideas. And then we've got the three areas: judicial, deliberative, demonstrative. And then within that, we have the huge difference between the Sophists and Plato. And it's all about little t truth, Sophists, big T truth, Plato. And they are like, nope, never gonna get along, never gonna see eye to eye on what they are. These are the foundations of early rhetorical theory, especially sophistic rhetorical theory. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know.